500 years ago, a man who went on to be one of the most controversial people in history walked timidly but angrily to a church in Germany. What he did at the door to the church had implications far beyond anything he could have imagined. And I find great value in slowing down every year at this time to remember and to reflect upon him, what he set in motion, and its ongoing impact. The man's name was Martin Luther, and he was about to trigger an intense religious, political, and cultural earthquake with its epicenter in the church in Rome. And at the time, the church was far beyond anything we can comprehend. That earthquake was set in motion by something Martin Luther did 1,000 miles away from Rome, in the heart of Germany. Luther had come up with 95 points he was hoping to have discussed at the highest levels of the church. They went on to be called his 95 Theses, and they set in motion what is known as the Reformation. They turned him into one of the most influential and controversial figures in world history, not just church history. I don't know if there's a way to talk about him without offending someone somewhere along the line. And actually, if someone's not offended, I've probably not portrayed him accurately. At the time, in the minds of pretty much everyone across his world, the church impacted virtually every part of life. There were different physical buildings, but the church meant the Pope-centered church based in Rome. By the time Martin Luther was born, the church had the kind of cultural influence we can't even imagine. When he was born in 1483, it wasn't yet known as the Catholic Church. It was the church. And when it first began to be used for the church, the word Catholic didn't label the church, it described the church. It meant for everyone. The original word for Catholic came from the Greek, and it meant for everyone. So, the church for everyone. Centuries passed before the word began to be written with a capital C. But when Martin Luther was still a young man, in 1512, top church leaders officially changed the name of a huge part of what was the Holy Roman Empire to Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Now, the fact that church leaders had that much influence in the formal formation of an empire speaks volumes about the kind of power the church had. And it had been that way for centuries. The Holy Roman Empire had been established 700 years earlier when Pope Leo III, the 97th of the 266 popes, named Charlemagne as emperor. And don't miss that. By the 800s, the Pope had the power to name the emperor. Now, by the time the church came up with the name the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, there was all kinds of tension and conflict between the Roman and the German parts of that. By the time Martin Luther was a young man, many Germans were fed up with the part Rome played in their lives and the way much of their money ended up there. However, there wasn't much they could do. Because even though it looked like the emperor was the supreme leader, in many ways the real power was with the Pope. And the church controlled life in ways the empire didn't and couldn't. See, again, it's impossible for us to comprehend what things were like under that system, including how something like baptism was at the heart of the culture. See, a core foundational belief was all babies were guilty of sin, and baptizing them as babies was the way to take care of that. The belief was baptism meant everyone could start out pure or saved. But as baptized babies went from adorable little bundles and blankets and learned to grab and to speak, sin became a problem. And that raised a question people have wrestled with or tried to avoid going back to Eden. What do you do with sin? See, the church at that time taught when you sinned, you lost some of what had been gained at baptism. You lost some of what had come with baptism. It was kind of like having a spiritual bank account, and sin made withdrawals from what had been deposited at baptism. In response to sin, the church began to call people to Mass, and the high point was the celebration of the host, bread and wine. And the priest would raise the host and say the Latin equivalent of the words of Jesus. This is my body, this is my blood. And the church taught those who took the host sincerely got their account filled back up. And to try to measure how sincere people were, penance began to be taught. And penance included contrition, that's being sorry for your sin, and confession, where you tell a priest about your sin, and then satisfaction, what you were told to do to show how sorry you really were. So part of a priest's job was to listen to a confession and then determine something like, okay, that's like X bad. And to wipe that out, go clean your neighbor's pig pen and then recite the Lord's Prayer while walking up that steep hill over there. That's a very simple and basic picture of the life and the faith that dominated the society Martin Luther was born into. But the rhythm was clear and everywhere. Baptism, sin, Mass, confession, penance. Then sin, Mass, confession, penance. It became a cycle that drove pretty much everything. And it was all about keeping your spiritual account full to make sure things were good between you and God. And ultimately, what you did and how well you did it determined how God saw you. And that can easily make its way into anyone's belief system. And continuing with the image of the bank account, the system of the church developed to where people could actually get a positive balance. So, say for example, after we finish, you help prepare boxes for Operation Christmas Child, and then go volunteer at Family Promise. And then you come back to South Bay after everyone's gone, and you disinfect all the bathrooms here and at Noah's Ark. Then on Monday morning, you go to the Long Beach Mission, and you help wash all the sheets and the blankets, and you remake the beds. And then in the afternoon, you spend 3 hours face down in the dark praying. See, 500 years ago, the belief was that could give you a positive balance in your spiritual account. You could hold on to that for when you had a bad couple of days, or you could pass it on to someone who had some kind of a spiritual deficit and didn't have a way to make it up. Well, the church system continued to evolve to where rather than doing penance, you could buy indulgences. That was basically a way to financially pay penance. The Pope was considered like the main banker of indulgences. And at first, the church was very careful to only offer indulgences every 100 years or so. Well, as money became more of a factor for the church, more indulgences were sold. Johann Tetzel, Google that man's story. He was a famous indulgence seller, and he was known for stirring the emotions of the people with a line like, "As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." and indulgences became increasingly important in the 12th century, especially as belief in purgatory grew. People had begun to worry what happened if they sinned and it was still 4 days until Mass, or they couldn't get to confession right away. A lot of people started worrying about what would happen if they died before they could get that taken care of. And it began to be taught that in those cases, people went to purgatory. It wasn't heaven, but although it was a horrible place, it wasn't hell. And many people began to believe indulgences could shorten the time someone spent in purgatory. There, people were purified from. They were purgatory of what kept them from heaven. That is, unless they had done something really bad or some mortal sin that got them sent straight to hell. But purgatory became a formal belief of the church not long before Martin Luther was born. And the church, as we will see, had an enormous influence on him from his earliest days. When he was still a toddler, his father started a mining business, and it became successful enough to let Luther go to school, which was a very rare opportunity. And in his case, he got to go to a school that was under the church. Well, Luther was quite critical of that school later in his life. He told of rude and even cruel teachers who often used repetition as a form of punishment. They would especially use the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. And as a student known to misbehave, Martin was forced to repeat a lot of those truths. Although it also further enforced his belief that there were a lot of things you had to do to keep God happy with you. Well, when he was 14, his father sent him away to school run by a monastery. So the church's impact on him deepened. Because of his brilliance, he began university at 17 and easily made his way through a bachelor's degree and then on to a master's, which was very impressive at the time. However, that was the point where he first began to really wrestle with what he later called Anfechtung. It meant deep spiritual anxiety or torment of the soul. And that intensified when Luther began to read the Bible for the first time. It was in the library at the university. He later referred to it as chained to the wall, but it's not clear if that was a literal statement or a metaphor, although it shows how carefully guarded Bibles were. See, the church strictly controlled teaching of the Bible, and having one of your own was considered a crime of rebellion. But Luther had access to one, and had learned enough Latin to be able to read it, and I'll explain the significance of that a little later. But Luther spent as much time as possible with that Bible, and he began to see things that clashed with what he had been taught his whole life, and that just kept feeding his Anfechtung. After completing his master's degree, under pressure from his father, Luther agreed to study law, but his heart and his mind were not in it. Then, on his way back to the university after one vacation, Luther was caught in a huge thunderstorm. And one lightning bolt hit so close, he was sure he was going to die. And he cried out, "Saint Anne, help me! I will become a monk!" St. Anne was the patron saint of miners, and families like his. Well, unlike many people who make those kinds of promises in moments of crisis, Luther kept his word to God. And 2 weeks later, despite his father's disapproval, he presented himself as a novice at one of the strictest monasteries to begin training to become a monk. Well, he was more educated than many of the priests, and that often led to mocking and mistreatment from many of the monks and even the priests. As a novice, he entered a period where his seriousness about it was evaluated, and he was put to work in the kitchen and cleaning the bathrooms. Novices could not have visitors, nor could they write nor receive letters without permission. They were not allowed to speak during their first month, not one word. Their world was isolation, study, confession, and prayer. Luther was one of just a few novices to be given a Bible. They weren't much use to most people because they were in Latin, and really old Latin. But Martin Luther devoured that Bible. And the leader of the monastery said Luther was the only man he had ever met who had actually read the Bible before officially becoming a monk. After the testing period, Martin was accepted into the monastery, and he was given his own tiny room, which he called a cell. One historian described life in the monastery as an endless and brutal time of mind-numbing routine, interspersed with times of study, devotion, and loneliness. Luther was taught the proper position and posture for prayer, and even how to walk. Head slightly bowed, eyes pointed toward the ground. The monks were called to prayer 7 times a day, starting at 4 a.m. Throughout every day, they recited the Lord's Prayer 175 times. They were taught to pray the Psalter. That's a combination of the Book of Psalms and reflective thoughts on it, all in Latin, so most didn't even know what they were saying. Well, Luther quickly memorized the Psalter, followed by memorizing the entire New Testament, all in Latin. And he was one of very few who actually understood what he was memorizing. But rather than calming his Anfechtung, it made it worse as he worked to frantically prove himself to a God he was terrified of. He often slept without blankets, even on the coldest nights, on the stone floor instead of the bed. And if he woke in the morning to find he had even pulled a sheet over himself, he was plagued by guilt. And he would spend hours raging against himself for all his sin and raging against the devil for being so hard on him. And one time he was found unconscious and bleeding. He had cut himself severely with this little whip they were given, mostly for just kind of like symbolic prayers. And many years later, Luther wrote, "I was a good monk, and I kept the rule of my order so strictly that I may say that if ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, it was I. If I had kept on any longer, I should have killed myself with vigils, prayers, reading, and other work." Well, Luther constantly felt the need to confess his sins, and he would go to the confessional and he would unload like everything. Confession was only required on Fridays, but he often went every day, sometimes staying for 6 hours. He would leave the confessional and remember something he had not confessed and go back in. Sometimes he would confess, not being able to remember something he was sure he needed to confess. And sometimes he would go back and confess he was afraid that he had not confessed sincerely enough. In frustration, one time the head of the monastery told him, "If you expect Christ to forgive you, come in with something to forgive. Murder, blasphemy, adultery, instead of all these little sins." Thing is, Luther actually had a realistic view of sin. So-called small sins are as damning as big ones. What he did not have was the only way to deal with sins, whatever size they may be. He once stayed in his cell for 3 straight days, and when they broke down the door, he was incoherent and delusional. And one historian wrote, he had repented himself almost into madness. Well, the head of the monastery decided there were only two things that might help Martin Luther: to teach the Bible and to make a pilgrimage to Rome first. See, Luther fully accepted the church's teaching on penance and indulgences, and Rome was like the most cherished destination for those. And Martin Luther walked the entire distance. We're talking almost 1,000 miles, including passing through the Swiss Alps in the winter. It was brutal and it was dangerous, but it was also ideal for someone who was eager to do any kind of penance to relieve his Anfechtung. Rome was considered so holy. Those who made pilgrimages there had unique access to many indulgences for themselves and for their family members. And that was especially true for priests, especially if they could get permission to lead Mass while there, which Luther did. The most famous incident came at the Sancta Scala. People came from everywhere to climb the 28 steps on those stairs, on their knees, kissing the steps and praying an Our Father, the Lord's Prayer, on each one. Each step was believed to remove 9 years from someone's time in purgatory. Steps with crosses carved into them counted double. But as Luther crawled up each step, he began to question, more than ever, whether it was actually getting him any closer to God. And he got to the top and looked down, and from the depths of his Anfechtung, he asked, who can know if these things are so? Well, when he got back to the monastery, his mentor saw Rome hadn't helped. So he went ahead with the next part of his plan and got Luther formally studying and teaching the Bible. Luther's response: seek a more worthy person. I cannot consent to it. It will kill me. Regardless, Luther was sent to university, where he would first be a student and then a teacher. And in 1512, he graduated as a Doctor of Holy Scripture and named the head of the university's theology department. It had been 7 years since his encounter with the lightning bolt and his plea to St. Anne. 7 years of studying and doing all the right things and then some. Despite that, the Anfechtung was more intense than ever. And he was going to have to teach the Bible on top of that. Which brings us to another thing our culture cannot comprehend, especially at a time when there are thousands of translations of the Bible in all kinds of languages. Back then, the Bible was only available in Latin. Anywhere in the world, only available in Latin. It had been that way for 1,000 years. And that antiquated Latin was the only legal language for the Bible. And only the most elite of the religious and academic elite could understand it. And Martin Luther was one of them. The original Bible languages were not formally taught, but Luther taught himself Greek, the original language of the New Testament, so he could read the original language, which was virtually unheard of anywhere. And he went on to continue to passionately study Latin and Greek, and then he would try to put it in a way that he could explain it in class. And many historians say he was masterful at putting the ancient languages in modern terms. And what he was learning about the Bible continued to clash with some of the most profound things he had always believed. Faith had been all about what you had to do in order to get good enough to be or to get right with God. And one writer said, for an introspective, slightly neurotic monk, the righteousness God demanded was terrifying. And Luther was struggling more than ever with how good enough was always one more good thing away. You understand? He struggled with this conviction for himself personally that being good enough was always one more good thing away. And that's why the book of Romans began to rock his world as he grew in his understanding of what things like this mean. We are made right with God through faith and not by obeying the law. We have peace with God because of what Jesus has done for us. Well, that seemed too good to be true for Luther, and it directly contradicted what the church had taught for centuries. And that had a lot to do with why he described himself as raging with fear and a troubled conscience and beating constantly on Paul, seeking a deeper and more clear understanding of righteousness, justification, and grace. And that pursuit of understanding grace brings us to the date I mentioned at the beginning. October 31st, 1517. All Saints' Day, a day the church had celebrated for almost 900 years. Well, that day, Martin Luther walked up the steps to the highly esteemed Castle Church in Wittenberg, and he carried papers he had painstakingly prepared, holding 95 points he wanted to talk about, essentially a summary of years of concerns and questions. And posting something on the door to the Castle Church was how people could get issues discussed or debated and or questions answered. Luther had written in Latin, so it seems to have been a call for a discussion with like the academic and the religious elite of the elite. For example, he had questions about the holy relics that had become a huge part of the church. The belief was if you showed the proper devotion to a relic, which often included paying to see it, you could earn things like time off purgatory. And Castle Church held almost 18,000 relics, including things like what was said to be a piece of Moses' burning bush, parts of Jesus' cradle, and even some of Mary's breast milk. Paying to see relics on All Saints' Day was understood to bring extra benefit, so the feast had become huge business. Well, not everyone believed all of that, and there have always been priests who have tried to teach against things like it, but the dominant force within the church promoted it. And the system had become enormous in terms of power, influence, and money. And Luther was emphatically challenging the system. Well, almost instantly, his 95 Theses put him up against the emperor, the pope, and 1,000 years of history. Luther was officially called to publicly apologize and promise to remain silent. And if not, he would be excommunicated, kicked out as a priest, and kicked out of the church. And that would bring far more shame and hardship than we can imagine. Well, Luther publicly burned the order, and he wrote and he spoke more than ever about his objections and his concerns, especially about all the effort that went into keeping people from seeing and learning about grace. Well, before long, he was ordered to appear before top leaders of both the church and the government. And he was given one last chance to recant. This is the most well-known part of his response to that order. He said, "My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and I will not recant anything. God, help me. Amen." Almost instantly, Luther's writings were officially and immediately banned, and he was declared a convicted heretic, although he had enough friends in high places to take exile at the Wartburg Castle. And there he translated the New Testament into German. And in 1522, it was published for the first time. And he went on to write more than almost anyone in history before dying at age 62. So much of what Martin Luther wrote was printed and spread like wildfire. And the fire spread into what came to be called the Reformation. And those who pursued it went on to be known as the Protestants, the Protestants, built on the defining word protest. And the core of the protest was against any belief that was not built on grace. The core of the protest behind the Protestant movement, the core of the protest was against any belief that was not built on grace. And in both human history and in church history, our roots can be traced back to it. And as I mentioned earlier, I find great value in taking the last week in October and the first week of November to remember and to reflect upon Martin Luther and what he set in motion 504 years ago. And then to wrestle with two questions. And I do this every year. And I encourage and I challenge you to do the same this week. What is church, really? And what difference does or should my answer to that make?